Okay, going to try this new program to put together some lectures. Apparently, the free version leaves a watermark in the upper left-hand corner, so just ignore that. That is not part of the notes, but it'll be, I guess, free advertising for this program. But sorry for the delay. I definitely want to get some content up about this particular lecture because it is really important to kind of map out the developments of what has contributed to the modern form of conservatism in the United States in its political form. So, again, remember, we've talked multiple times already about the way in which political ideologies or like philosophies that sort of become politicized, right? So, like this idea of liberalism. We talked about this idea of classical liberalism all the way back to the Enlightenment era and what that meant and how it sort of evolved. Same thing with conservatism, right? So like this like belief that or really in some ways this form of a political ideology, at least in the United States, right? Because this would be different depending on what political system you're looking at in what part of the world and what time in history. All these things are contingent on various factors, as we've talked about, right? There's not one thing that develops or contributes to any of these movements or the evolving of these ideas. But if we have to start to think about, okay, what makes up the current sort of like conservative ideas, we can start to look into like this era that I'm going to talk about right now, sort of in response to what is known as like liberalism, right? And so we'll try to unfold that to get to what makes up the heart of like conservatism today in American politics. And it really we have to start. We have to go back a little bit into the '60s to take a look at some of its what became its modern origins, and then we'll take a look at sort of Ronald Reagan and what he began to put in place, and then how we sort of look at this in its modern form. So it started as a, again, remember that much of what makes up the core of conservative politics, the like the core of it, right? And again, this is not. I'm not going to cover everything that is now associated with those who identify as conservatives, right? And at least in today's country, like in today's political climate, most people who would self-identify as conservative also would align with the Republican Party in today's sort of political terminology, right? But again, remember, these things are always in constant flux and changing and adapting. Um, but that's the best way to sort of place these things. And so what this became then was initially it becomes a response. So remember, throughout the 1950s, we talked about, going back to that lecture and those discussions, we talked about how it was really important in this Cold War climate in the 1950s to create these very, very defined gender roles between, a mom and a dad that required them to fit into the sort of social, cultural, and then sometimes politically defined ideas of manhood and womanhood and what those meant. And so there was a belief then that throughout the 1960s, the the social and cultural movements that came out of that I talked about a little bit last time in the 1970s lecture, especially one of the movements that became very much sort of vilified was the second wave feminism or the modern feminist movement. In some ways, became by some people, and you saw if you watch the documentary, and if you have not, you need to because there will be exam questions in that documentary. specifically related to, remember in there they talked about the woman Phyllis Schlafly, and how Schlafly was, she was trying to keep the traditional family model, as what she was out advocating that, the women who were wanting to enter the workforce and create more social equality were actually, um, opposed to traditional family models and did not want to be mothers, and they were revolutionaries and all these like very placing like women who just wanted to be treated as equal as actually like wanting to up into this like system, right? But you have to believe that there is some, you have to believe that there's some authority to this traditional family model in order to sort of align with that idea that Schlafly was pushing. Um, and so there is a movement, that begins to, or sort of a belief that begins to form as people believe that, well, that's where real America is at, right? The 1950s, for some of these people, that's where real America is at. But again, remember that that presentation of that model, um, is very much dependent on, these traditional gender roles, and also like there's, you can even begin to pull that out and sort of like, okay, well, what's going on racially in the United States as well? In the 1950s, Jim Crow is still legal. So there's also like implications and what this means for people, in like racial terms as well, if that's where the true America's at. But either way, there's this gleaming to that, um, that's where real American values are at, and the United States has gone too far. And this idea is really, comes sort of into form in the 1964 presidential election. And, there was a candidate who was running, Barry Goldwater, who ended up losing to Johnson in this election. But he begins to take those ideas I just talked about. He begins to take all of that and embed it into the Republican Party's sort of platform in some ways. And one of those things that he really harped on in his campaign was, pushing back against the liberal consensus. Remember this idea that throughout most of the Cold War, you had both Democratic and Republican, presidents and candidates and politicians who aligned for the most part with a lot of things. And one of those things that both seemed to have to support at the time was big government. The liberal welfare state that had, come out of the Great Depression. Remember, FDR, one of the things he did to help combat, the the depression was to, grow the government, because clearly, remember, putting in social safety nets that requires government oversight. If you're going to, want to ensure that everybody's money is safe in banks, you need federal oversight. If you're going to ensure that, try to get people back to work, that requires federal oversight. If you, want to make sure there's a social safety net in place, like Social Security or, unemployment, that requires federal oversight. So there was the growing of the government to, and then, social welfare programs as well, right? Um, Government oversight or, government funding of programs that will keep people from bottoming out, right? So things like, um, uh, food stamps, right? So these things that were created by the government to help people navigate through times in which the natural flow of the economy might let them might not be working for them. So Goldwater, is going to attack that. And you see in that quote there, he comes out and he's like, well, you know what? A government that's big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take all of that away. So he begins to like instill this mistrust in government oversight that grew out of the Great Depression and was part of the like much of the 1950s into the 1960s, in that, framing it in this sense that, you know the growth of the government is what's the problem. And remember, Nixon, that's what Nixon used in that Southern strategy. If you remember from the last lecture, Nixon's attempts to reach out to a certain demographic of American voters in the South particularly, remember, because he tried to sort of erase like the racial tension by claiming that it was big government that was the problem in the South, right? So like there are certain things that the government has done that has gone too far, even though in reality it was people opposed to overturning of Jim Crow. He's trying to sort of ignore that whole racial tension by saying that it's just the government's fault, right? So like there's this message that becomes embedded then in the uh, the Republican Party, in which it's now beginning to it starts with Goldwater, but it doesn't really entrench itself until Reagan. But Goldwater begins the message that um, people should not trust a government that has grown to the size that it did throughout the liberal consensus era from the 40s, 50s, and into the 1960s. Um, and even to the point, that equality had gone too far. Like you're enforcing equality, so affirmative action that comes out of the civil rights legislation, and believing that you can't force people to be equal, which in some ways has you know there's something to that argument, right? You can't change somebody's like overnight, right? You can't just pass like the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65. After they're passed, it's not like people who once were racist to simply stop the being racist. That doesn't happen. But there also is some concern there, because then it begins to, once again, it takes the system that has always um, you know, treated people differently based on skin color, and it begins to try to erase the history of that inequity that was inherited, and shifts the blame not on people's racism, but shifts the blame just on um, you know sort of gross negligence of government overreach, right? So it's trying to shift the problems that people had experienced after the Civil Rights Acts were not their like wish to continue to be like the problem was not them wanting to continue to be racist. The problem was the government's too big, right? So that's sort of this shift that happens with this sort of message in some ways. So then, so once the message is kind of out there in the like in a political form that Goldwater started, um, it will be actually sort of put in place with Reagan and what some historians call the Reagan Revolution. Um, so he developed this kind of three pronged attack against the liberal forms of American politics in his campaign. And so the three pronged approach that he took in the election of 1980 was a hawkish foreign policy. Hawkish means you want to be more aggressive, right? You trying to get out ahead of any sort of potential conflict. Um, So one thing was he was going to reinvest in the military, grow the military, try to essentially outspend the Soviet Union, because the Cold War still was going on in the 1980s, and Reagan wanted to focus on trying to spend more militarily, knowing that the Soviet Union would have to sort of counter that and see if he could sort of force them to spend at a rate that they would not be able to sustain. Laissez-faire economics, again, it's the return, right? So like Reagan takes this approach that, again, big government is bad, right? That's the message. Too much government oversight actually inhibits economic growth, was his message. And to a degree, yes, that can be the case. But we also have to think about, okay, so what were the reasons that government had to get involved in the first place? Think back to the Gilded Age, right? Like we have evidence, and we know that companies, corporations, these businesses were doing things that were immoral, illegal, and without the government stepping in, they would have continued to do these things. And it took sort of this government oversight in order to monitor the activities of these companies. And Reagan's message is, well, though we've just gone too far with that. We need to peel those back, and we have to trust that the natural flow of the economy will tell us which companies are going to survive and which ones won't. So he's like, get government out of doing that and put it back in the hands of the economy. And then he also doubled down on that idea that I mentioned a little bit earlier about like that core family model as where true American values lied. And so that aligns kind of with the rise of this much more moving very much more religious right, like sort of fundamentalism, evangelicalism, that we think of today as this religious right that very much relies on that sort of 1950s family model, uh, of mom and dad and kids and like these very distinct and defined gender roles and expectations, right? So he's saying that's where the party needs to move in order to like re um, get back in touch with its true values of the past. And you can see here, he wins in a landslide. There was a belief that, again, coming out of the 1970s, remember there was stagflation, high unemployment, high inflation. So there were people wanted, and attach themselves to a message of like, okay, there's going to be something different, right? Change. And so again, just sort of like what Reagan was trying to achieve after becoming president was, for again, if the belief is that government's growing too big, that means that you know government funding relies on taxpayers. So making those connections, right? Well, part of the reason that you had problems, and part of our economic problems, Reagan would say, part of the problems that we have are we're taxing you too much, right? He would tell the American people, the government's taxing you too much. We've done all these things to grow the government on the taxpayers' dollar, and it's not working, right? So that was the message that tied to taxes are bad, big government is bad. We can shrink government and loosen up taxes, right? So he was like, those two things became very much like connected as well, where it's implied that taxing means bigger government, and that's both of those are bad, right? So that's one thing that happens. And again, one of the things that is targeted in all of this, it's not they're not going to start shrinking government spending because remember Reagan was trying to make sure that the United States could outspend the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So there's going to be if you're going to begin to shrink government, it's not happening in certain spending areas, right? Because that's growing. He's not defunding NASA or anything yet either. So where are you going to make up these? Where are you going to start to pull government oversight back? Or are you going to start to shrink the taxpayers' burden and its social welfare programs? So you can see that $25 billion in cuts were made throughout the 1980s, and you start to remove people from these social welfare programs that were put in place to try because Lyndon Johnson he was trying to end poverty in America. That was one of the goals that Lyndon Johnson wanted to obtain, was ending poverty, and that required the support of these government programs. Where Reagan's message is, well, that's part of what the problem is. And then you can see in his radio address there that quote. And so he he makes this comment about you know okay, we declared war on poverty, but in the end poverty won. And so and again it's he pivots back to this idea of family, right? He's saying that instead of helping the poor, the government has actually done a disservice with these programs. And creating this supply side economics, which in reality is a form of trickle down economics, which we know that did not work to because that was Hoover's approach to trying to end the Great Depression. We know that did not help. Um, so when the economy is more stable and you put something like this in place, it can have an initial sort of like there can be the creation of more jobs. Um, but again, you have to think, okay, it requires then that those jobs are constantly there, or there's constantly people, or there's constantly jobs that people can live off of available. That's like this Reaganomics or supply side economics can be effective, but it requires then that any of those jobs that are there and available offer people a living wage, basically, right? Like they could have that one job and not, have to worry about paying bills and things like that. And with the deregulation of so many of government oversight in certain areas, we know that that began to be sort of eroded away as the the wages of working class Americans remained stagnant, and the wages of supervisors, CEOs, went up exponentially, and it's created this huge income gap then. Um, and so that the Economic Recovery Act, basically it helped more wealthy Americans. Again, most supply side approaches or trickle down economics heavily favors the already wealthy and corporate elite. And so we think about, okay, again, remember, where is spending being cut at? It's social welfare programs. It is not the military. And you can see defense spending in the United States. Uh, that clearly, because of the Cold War, goes up a lot, and then sort of dropped back down, and then increased obviously with the Vietnam War, then dropped back down again, and then went back up with Reagan, and then has gone up and has remained pretty high after 9/11. Um, but again, it's this is something else that has become sort of a part of this like conservative political ideology, is also like this, because military spending has increased. It it presents this idea of support for the military, when what does that look what does actually supporting the military look like, in like, if we start to like look beneath the surface, what would that actually, what would be the certain criteria we'd look for like supporting military personnel, right? And so that's where some of the discussion comes in now, where it's like, well, you just can't bloat the military spending, and claim that you're like, you know for the troops and everything, if when you look down at the bottom level, there still is like, a lot of oops there's still a lot of underfunding of just basic needs that soldiers need to have. There's a lot of waste going into certain programs, uh, and also something that is continually and ongoing. How are veterans treated when veterans come back from war, when they've done their service and duty? And we know that the veteran affairs programs, a lot of times, are heavily underfunded and do not have enough. So it's like, where is that money going, right? And what does it mean? But again, that's another sort of idea that sort of attached itself to these conservative political ideology. And then, again, like this idea of the family, right? Uh, this traditional family model was what made America, um, you know, this international superpower in the 1950s. It relied on that. Think back to Nixon and the kitchen debates. Think about all that stuff. And so that's where, and And again, in this sort of 1980, sort of throughout the 1970s, the reaction to a lot of the second wave feminism, um, a lot of the opposition were from people who maintained like very conservative religious views. Someone like Phyllis Schlafly, again, who saw women who wanted to enter the workforce and not maybe not necessarily get married as actually like contributing to the destruction of the United States because it relied on this family model to be maintained. And so then like Reagan sort of using then again that same sort of kind of idea that um, if the United States puts its focus back on the family and these family quote unquote family values, whatever that might mean, um, then the United States will prosper, right? So he kind of looks at it as okay, well, the family is not now necessarily needed to defeat communism anymore. It's grown past that. We will defeat communism, but we need America to save. We're saving America from itself because of all like the fracturing of this belief of a fractured country through the pushing of better treatment to different groups of people who wanted to finally be acknowledged as individuals in this country. um, the reaction to that, right? So like um, women who wanted to maybe not get married and have a family, they were harming this core identity of America, which was the family. Someone like Reagan would argue, and therefore they need to accept these more traditional gender roles again in order to keep the family at the heart and keep America strong. So then, the idea of family values is important, and so then you think about, you know, again, where, and this is sort of like what's interesting because like this idea of what does big government mean, right? And if if the idea of big government is um, if the idea of big government is like government oversight and influence is pervasive in areas it shouldn't be, right? If that's the idea of like government that's too big, then we also need to think about, okay, well, what does that mean for the private sphere, right? So someone like Reagan argued that government spending and government has grown too big, and he talked about social welfare programs, right? That was one of the things he targeted. Look at all the spending that we're doing. Um, you know, we need to cut back on that. Nixon sort of targeted school integration, forced integration. Saying that that's government oversight grown too far. But you also need to look. It's not always directly related to spending. Government can be big and not spend a dime, and part of that is okay, how is the government defining you, the individual, in its relationship to it? If the government is saying that we don't acknowledge you as or we will not acknowledge your uh, sort of identity, right? So you think about like LGBTQ community, right? Those do not fit into, for the most part, that's not fitting into this traditional family model. So then you can grow government big in this political aspect that will then deny people certain rights the government's supposed to guarantee because it will not extend the idea of citizenship onto that person's identity. So if that makes sense, right? So it's like, so the idea that government, you can only identify big government by spending has to ignore the fact that government can be big in how it defines people's citizenship as well, right? We saw that with like Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws that when they were determined legal, there was not like federal spending that needed to go in to sustain that. It was a system of racism that was sustaining it. But the government's like condoning of that made a statement about African Americans and their citizenship, right? So it implies this belief that the government has about race that makes us that has a direct impact on people's rights. And that in itself is also big government, right? So it's always like, it's not, when you say big government, you don't always have to tie it to spending. It's also how big is the government's influence in policies that can either guarantee or inhibit people's rights based on a particular ideology that is part of that party's platform. And with Reagan in the 80s and this family values platform, it meant wanting to only help and support those who wanted to conform to those, once again, traditional gender roles. Anybody who did not was seen as a radical, someone who was anti-American, right? So you can shift this sort of like, you can shift shortcomings of the country away from the actual realities of stuff that are like rooted in economic policies. Like bad economic policy can be sort of scapegoated by, well, it's not, that's not what's wrong. It's that, you know, there are these women who do not want to be stay-at-home moms. That's where, and then that's deteriorating the family. So then those families don't have people who grow up and buy into this American system, and it can, it's a perpetual cycle. Then is sort of what they're trying to sort of erect in this argument. And so, and then it leaves us, I think, here's another excerpt from one of the, you read the chapter Last Man to Die from this book here. It's a really good book. But this line here by Self in the book, thinking about kind of what I just got done talking about, right? The social contract, that's the idea that Rousseau laid out in the Enlightenment about just what should be the actual relationship between the government and its people, right? What is this sort of understood agreement, and who is included in constructing those agreements is what Self's getting at with this quote here. Who has the power and right to say to to construct those rights that the government is going to acknowledge and guarantee. So I know a lot to kind of think about there. But if you have any questions, please, send them my way, and we can probably talk more about some things as well with our last discussion.